Imagine a man standing on top of a mountain at the exact moment the sun rises. Not a tourist who came there to photograph the spectacle, an astronomer priest who spent 40 years learning to distinguish, in the field of forces that surround the earth, what the physical observation of the sky expresses on the deepest spiritual level. A being who had gone through initiation processes that most human beings of his time would never experience, who had learned to perceive in the space beyond the celestial bodies the spiritual currents that the movements of these bodies expressed as writing expresses the thoughts of those who traced it. For this being, the spring that most observers saw as a phenomenon of beauty was a spiritual document that revealed the state of the forces that governed the development of the earth at that precise moment. And at the moment that the Christian tradition would place at the center of its entire narrative about what was most important in the history of humanity, this being perceived something in the spiritual field that surrounded the planet that had not been equivalent in 40 years of rigorous observation. A presence of a magnitude that its tradition had not developed categories to completely describe, because it had never before been necessary to describe it. Rudolf Steiner had arrived at the narrative of the Magi by a different path than any theologian or exegete who had approached the same text before him. He did not arrive at it through the philological analysis of the Greek terms in Matthew's Gospel, although he knew this analysis in considerable depth. He did not arrive at it by comparing the religious traditions of the ancient Near East that could have influenced the narrative, although this context was not unknown to him either. He arrived using the method he had developed over decades, in which he called spiritual investigation, the direct reading of the spiritual processes that had generated the events that the texts preserved, the perception of what had happened on the spiritual plane before expressing itself on the physical plane in the events that the narrative described. And what he found transformed the episode of the Magi from a colorful story about exotic visitors into one of the points of greatest spiritual density in the entire evangelical narrative, the point at which the most developed spiritual knowledge that the pre-Christian world had produced bowed before something that had arrived to transform all the spiritual knowledge that had gone before. The first obstacle to understanding what Steiner saw in the Magi was what the word mage had become in modern parlance. In Portuguese, in English, in any Western language, the term carried associations that ranged from the conjurer to the practitioner of occult arts, including the student of hermetic sciences of varying seriousness. None of these associations captured what the word meant in the context in which Matthew had used it. The Greek word magoi was the transliteral of the ancient Persian term that designated the members of the Zoroastrian priestly caste, who were the custodians and practitioners of a tradition of spiritual knowledge that had been transmitted through generations with the precision of a science, the guardians of the sacred flame that had been entrusted to their tradition by the prophet Zarathustra centuries before, the investigators of the correspondences between the movements of the stars and the processes taking place on the spiritual plane, the interpreters of dreams and omens that the spiritual world sent to those who had developed the sensitivity to perceive them. Steiner did not see these priest astronomers of the East as simply an older, less technically equipped version of what modern astronomy had become. I saw in them the representatives of a form of knowledge that had developed by means different from those of modern science, something that modern science had not yet achieved. The ability to perceive the spiritual plane that expressed itself in the physical phenomena of the cosmos with the same clarity and the same reliability with which modern physical science perceived the laws that govern material phenomena. This capacity had not simply been declared. It had been developed through rigorous, decades-long training processes that modified the inner constitution of the being, passing through them in ways that made spiritual perception possible, in the same way that a musician's training modifies auditory sensitivity in ways that make possible sonic perceptions that the untrained ear cannot reach. What distinguished this form of knowledge from any form of magic or divination, in the pejorative sense that these words had acquired, was precisely the rigor and systematicity of the developmental process that made perception possible. It was not a gift that simply happened to certain people with an especially sensitive temperament. It was a capacity that had to be developed through systematic inner work, which required specific moral qualities as a condition for the development of spiritual faculties, which progressed in identifiable stages with characteristics that tradition had described with sufficient precision so that teachers could follow the development of disciples and identify where they were in the process. It was, in other words, a science, a systematic investigation of aspects of reality that ordinary consciousness did not directly reach, conducted with methods that had been tested over generations and that produced verifiable results within the context of tradition. Steiner developed with particular attention the question of why three specific traditions had reached the same point at the time of Christmas, and what this convergence revealed about the nature of the event they recognized. The traditions he identified as represented by the Magi, the Persian, the Chaldean, and the Egyptian, were the three great currents of initiatory knowledge that had governed the spiritual development of the ancient world in the centuries preceding the birth of Christ. Each one had developed their own way of accessing the spiritual plane, their own language to describe what they perceived, their own methodology of investigation. And each had arrived through different paths and with different instruments at a point where what they had developed was simultaneously the highest they had been able to achieve and insufficient for what was to come. The Persian tradition had been founded, centuries before Christmas, by the prophet Steiner, called Zarathustra, and had developed over generations a form of knowledge that he saw as especially relevant to the preparation of the Christ event. Zarathustra had been, in Steiner's perspective, one of the most developed initiates in the spiritual history of humanity, a being who had reached a level of spiritual perception that his contemporaries could barely understand, and who had transmitted to his spiritual current an impulse that would unfold over centuries. What the Persian current had preserved from this original impulse was especially the knowledge of the spiritual forces that operated in the processes of nature and the cosmos, the perception that behind the physical phenomena of the world, there were spiritual forces of different qualities and different hierarchies that were the true agents of the processes that physical observation saw only in their most external expression. The Chaldean current had developed, from the inheritance it had received from even more ancient civilizations, a form of knowledge that Steiner saw as complementary to that of the Persian tradition. Not only the perception of spiritual forces in the processes of nature, but the perception of how these forces expressed themselves in the movements of the celestial bodies in ways that made it possible to read in these movements the writing of the spiritual processes that governed the development of the earth and of humanity over time. The distinction between what the Chaldeans did and what modern astronomy does was, for Steiner, the distinction between two radically different types of relationship with the same object of observation. Modern astronomy saw in the movements of the planets physical processes governed by mathematical laws that described their trajectories with increasing precision. The initiated Chaldeans saw in the same movements the expression of spiritual processes that took place on planes that physical observation could not reach, and that used celestial movements as the clockwork uses hands, as the external manifestation of an internal process of a completely different nature. The Egyptian current was the one that had preserved, with greater richness and greater elaboration, the knowledge of the processes that governed existence beyond the threshold of death. The Egyptian mysteries had developed over millennia an understanding of the nature of the human being in its dimensions that transcended the physical body, and had developed initiation practices that made it possible for the initiate to experience something in life that most human beings only experienced after death, the encounter with the spiritual dimensions of existence that habitually remained beyond the reach of ordinary incarnated consciousness. What this tradition had preserved with special care was the knowledge that the human being was a spiritual being temporarily inhabiting a physical body, that it had existed before birth, and that it would continue to exist after death, and that spiritual development during incarnated life had an importance that went far beyond the limits of any individual life. The convergence of these three traditions at the moment of birth expressed, from Steiner's perspective, something that transcended historical coincidence. Ica expressed that the event that had arrived was of a nature that none of the three traditions could fully recognize from its own isolated perspective, and that only the combination of what each had developed created the field of recognition complete enough for the magnitude of the event to be at least approximately perceived. The Persian tradition perceived the spiritual forces of an etheric nature that the event had produced in the field surrounding the earth. The Chaldean tradition perceived the expression of these forces in the movements and configurations of the stars, and the Egyptian tradition perceived the nature of the spiritual being that had arrived, identified its position in the hierarchy of spiritual beings with a precision that none of the other traditions had developed the instruments to achieve. The event that the three traditions perceived from three complementary angles was what Steiner described as the descent of the solar logos into the terrestrial sphere, the arrival into the interior of incarnated human existence of a being who had operated on the earth from the outside, through solar forces, without ever before having penetrated into the terrestrial sphere in ways that made him present in physical existence with the same immediacy with which human beings were present. The solar logos had been related to the development of the earth and humanity since the most remote stages of cosmic evolution, but always as a force that acted from the outside in, as the sun acts on the earth, illuminating, warming, sustaining vital processes, without ever becoming part of the reality it sustained. The event of Christmas was the moment when this force had penetrated within, that had taken over the human condition in ways that made it present not just as a force that acted, but as a being that inhabited and shared the experiences that inhabiting the earth created. For initiates who had developed awareness of the spiritual forces operating in the cosmos, this event was perceptible with the clarity that developed spiritual awareness created. Not as an inference from data, not as a conclusion that resulted from a process of reasoning, but as a direct perception of something that was present in the spiritual field with an intensity that was unprecedented in all that the traditions had recorded. It was as if the quality of the spiritual forces that enveloped the earth had changed in a way that made it immediately apparent to any being with sufficient spiritual sensitivity that something had happened that had not happened before. The star that the narrative described was the expression of this transformed field of forces, the reflection on the plane of the visible phenomena of a transformation that had occurred primarily on the spiritual plane. The question of the star had occupied generations of scholars who had tried to identify it with verifiable astronomical phenomena, conjunctions of planets, comets, novae, or supernovae that could have been observed in the period in which Jesus' birth had occurred. Steiner did not deny that there could be a corresponding physical phenomenon, but he saw the issue as secondary to what the star expressed on the spiritual plane. What had guided the Magi was not primarily a phenomenon visible in the physical sky, which could have been observed by any astronomer of the time without setting them in motion toward Bethlehem. It was the perception of the transformed spiritual field that the physical phenomenon expressed in a way that only initiates with the appropriate training could read. The perception that the quality of the spiritual presence that had arrived in the terrestrial sphere had a specific location, a point of convergence that sufficiently developed perception could identify with sufficient precision to guide the journey that was to follow, be done. The gold that the Magi brought had, from Steiner's perspective, a precision that went far beyond the conventional symbolism of a gift fit for a king. Gold was, in the alchemical and hermetic philosophical traditions that had developed in the initiatory currents of the ancient world, the metal in which the solar forces had condensed in the most perfect form that the mineral kingdom knew. The relationship between gold and the sun was not a metaphor. It was a spiritual reality that initiatory traditions had perceived as a fact of the spiritual nature of matter, in the same way that iron was related to Mars and copper to Venus, not as a poetic abstraction, but as an actual correspondence between the spiritual forces that governed the development of each planet and the spiritual forces that had created each metal in the mineral kingdom of Earth. Bringing gold to the newborn was the gesture of recognition of those who had realized that the being that had arrived was the solar logos in human form, that the force that had always been there, parroted on Earth through the sun, had now penetrated into terrestrial existence by incarnating in a human being, and that gold was the most precise gift that an initiate who had perceived this reality could bring to encounter its manifestation. The incense that the second stream brought was the gift of recognition of the divine nature that had taken on human form. In the religious traditions of the ancient Near East, incense had been used to create the right environment for the presence of the sacred, to mark the spaces and moments in which the border between the human and the divine became more tenuous and communication between the two planes more direct. It was the substance that went up in smoke as the physical gesture of a spiritual orientation, the material expression of the movement of the human towards that which transcended the human. But offering incense not as an act toward an absent deity, but as a gift to a specific being who was physically present, was a gesture of a specificity that completely transformed its meaning. It was the recognition that the being they approached was himself the one the incense had always been burned to reach. It was the affirmation that the divine had arrived, that the distance between the human and the sacred, that the incense had always expressed as guidance in a direction had been crossed by the sacred itself coming towards the human. Myrrh was the most profoundly paradoxical gift of the three, and the most revealing of the quality of spiritual perception that the Magi possessed. It was the embalming substance of the dead, the balm that had been used in funerary traditions to preserve bodies awaiting what would come after death. Offering myrrh to a newborn who had arrived into the world a few days ago was a gesture that violated all the conventions of what was appropriate to give as a gift at birth, and precisely because it violated these conventions, it revealed that it had been chosen not based on conventions, but based on a perception that completely surpassed them. The initiate who had developed through the practices of the Egyptian tradition the understanding of death that this tradition had cultivated with greater depth than any other, perceived around the newborn the shadow of a future death that would be of a category radically different from any death that his tradition had prepared him to understand. It was not the death of a great initiate who crossed the threshold with the consciousness that his training had developed, which was the highest model of death that the Egyptian mysteries had been able to describe. It was the death of the solar logos who had assumed the human condition, the death of a divine being who had penetrated into earthly existence with all its limits and with all its vulnerability, including the vulnerability to death that was the most fundamental mark of the human condition. And this death would have a cosmic importance that went far beyond what Egyptian tradition had developed the categories to describe. It would be the moment when the divine being who had assumed humanity would die with and for it in ways that would transform the spiritual substance of human death for all human beings who would live after it. There was a connection that Steiner established between the narrative of the Magi and his understanding of what he called the problem of the two Jesuses, which was one of the most specific and most challenging aspects of his reading of the infancy Gospels, and which had direct implications for understanding what the Magi had perceived. Steiner maintained, based on his spiritual investigation of the evangelical texts, that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke describe two different births: that of a boy Jesus, who belonged to the royal lineage of David, and who was the one who received the visit from the Magi, according to Matthew, and that of a boy Jesus, who belonged to the priestly lineage of David, and who was the one who received the adoration of the shepherds, according to Luke. Matthew's baby Jesus had come into the world with a karma that Steiner saw as the expression of the highest spiritual qualities that humanity had developed through incarnations of civilizational leadership and cultural development in its highest forms. It was the being that carried the distilled product of centuries of human development in its noblest and highest aspects, that had in its spiritual constitution the expression of what human effort had been able to achieve when directed with the greatest depth and the greatest possible seriousness towards the highest dimensions of existence. And the Magi, who were themselves representatives of the most developed forms of what human effort had achieved in terms of spiritual knowledge, perceived in this being at the same time the highest expression of what humanity had been able to produce by its own means, and the sense of spiritual forces that indicated that what had arrived at that birth was also infinitely more than the product of human effort, however high that product was. There was also one aspect of the narrative that Steiner saw as especially revealing, and that was rarely developed with the depth it deserved: the specific nature of what happened when the Magi came into the boy's presence and prostrated themselves before him. Prostration was not just the conventional gesture of respect that visitors of lower status offered to a being of higher status. It was, from the perspective of the initiates who performed it, the gesture of recognition of the spiritual reality they had perceived, the gesture that expressed in body language what no words could fully express: that the being before whom they found themselves had a dimension that completely transcended what any system of categories they had developed could contain, and that the most appropriate response to what transcended the system was not to try to force it into the system, but simply to recognize what had arrived with the humility that genuine recognition always produces. This humility was not weakness. It was the expression of one of the highest aspects that initiatory formation had developed in the Magi: the ability to recognize the limits of one's own knowledge system, to perceive when what was being encountered exceeded what the system had developed to describe, and to receive that excess with the openness that was the highest form of intelligence that any genuine knowledge system would have if it was to remain genuine. The initiate who had reached the highest point of his tradition, and who there found something that his tradition had not developed the categories to fully understand, was at the most important moment in his entire formation: the moment when the system of knowledge that had been constructed met its own boundary, and when the response to what lay beyond the boundary determined whether the knowledge had been genuine, or whether it had been merely the carefully polished mirror that reflected what the system had already projected as its highest possibility. The Magi responded with prostration and gifts, which were the most precise language that their knowledge systems had developed for that type of situation. And then they went by another path, which was the most fundamental consequence of the encounter. One could not return to the starting point after having perceived what they perceived, because the starting point had been irrevocably transformed by the perception of what was beyond it. The return journey was not the outward journey in the opposite direction. It was a journey into territory that the meeting had opened up, and that the original starting point had not been able to anticipate, because what had been found had revealed the existence of a territory that no map drawn up before the meeting had recorded. Steiner saw in the narrative of the Three Kings, in all its historical and spiritual concreteness, the eternal symbol of a dynamic that repeated itself at any moment when the genuine development of knowledge reached its point of greatest tension, the moment when the most developed and most rigorous system that could be constructed met with that which exceeded it in ways that no development of the system could achieve by its own means. The response to that moment defined what the system had really been. If it had been the genuine search for reality, it responded with the recognition and offering of what it had achieved in the service of what had arrived. If it was a search for confirmation of what I already knew, I responded with resistance, or with an attempt to domesticate what had arrived within the categories that the system already had. The mages responded in the first way. And that is why they continue to arrive at any time in any form that the most serious and honest spiritual development of each time produces. Arriving from afar, following what was perceived with the willingness to go where it leads, arriving at the encounter with what was perceived, offering to the encounter what was achieved along the way, and leaving along another path that the encounter revealed, and that the starting point had never been able to map. This is the journey that the narrative of the Magi has preserved with the fidelity that sacred texts sometimes achieve when what they record is real enough to withstand the wear and tear of time and repeated interpretation, and deep enough to continue revealing layers that no interpretation has yet fully exhausted. To complete the perspective that Steiner had elaborated on the Magi, it was necessary to address a theme that he developed with particular richness in his lectures on the Gospels, and that rarely appeared in conventional interpretations of the narrative. The role of the Magi in the continuity of the tradition of spiritual knowledge that would culminate in what he called the Rosicrucians, and in the Christian esoteric current that had traversed the centuries of Western development in progressive dialogue with the Christic impulse that Christmas had introduced. The idea that Steiner was developing was that the Magi were not simply visitors who had fulfilled their role in the Christmas drama and then disappeared from spiritual history. They were representatives of currents of knowledge that continued to operate in subsequent centuries, transformed by contact with the new impulse that the encounter with the newborn had created. Each of the three traditions that the Magi represented had taken back to its specific environment something that the encounter had permanently changed, not the complete teachings of what had arrived, which could not yet be fully articulated at a time when the process that Christmas had begun was only at its starting point, but the guidance, the direction, the quality of expectation that had been created by the recognition of what had arrived and which was to influence the subsequent development of these traditions in ways that the spiritual history of the West would hold in its deepest currents. The Hermetic tradition, which had flourished in the encounter between Egyptian wisdom and Greek thought in the environment of Hellenistic Alexandria, was one of the points where this influence had become most visible. The Hermetic texts that had been attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus, and that had profoundly influenced the development of Neoplatonism and many of the philosophical and religious currents of the first centuries of the Christian era, preserved elements of the Egyptian tradition that had been modified by contact with the new impulse, in ways that made these texts simultaneously expressions of ancient wisdom and anticipations of what Christic development was to produce in subsequent centuries. The Rosicrucian current, which had emerged with greater visibility in the early 17th century, but which Steiner saw as having roots that extended much deeper into the spiritual history of the West, was one of the points at which the currents of wisdom that the Magi represented had reached the level of integration with the Christ impulse that the encounter at Christmas had made possible, but that had taken centuries of development to realize. The question of how to understand the narrative of the Magi in the broader context of the evolution of human consciousness that Steiner had developed in works such as The Occult Science and the Philosophy of Freedom was another dimension that deserved attention. The development that Steiner described as the great post-Atlantic epochs of human evolution had created, in each epoch, a specific form of consciousness and a specific type of relationship with the spiritual plane that corresponded to the needs and possibilities of that phase of development. The time in which the Magi lived, which Steiner identified as the fourth post-Atlantic epoch or the Greco-Roman epoch, was the period when individual human consciousness was reaching the point of its most complete separation from the collective spiritual background from which it had emerged, the point at which the human being was becoming more completely an individual separate from the spiritual cosmos that had given rise to it. This process of separation was both necessary for the development of human freedom, which required complete individuation as its condition of possibility, and dangerous for the relationship with the spiritual plane that previous epochs had maintained in a more direct but less conscious way. The great initiates of the Greco-Roman era, who still possessed something of the faculties of spiritual perception that earlier epochs had developed, but who were beginning to realize that these faculties were becoming less natural and more difficult to maintain as individual consciousness consolidated, were in an especially delicate position. They were the last representatives of the forms of spiritual knowledge that had governed earlier epochs, at a time when the development of consciousness was making these forms progressively less accessible to humanity as a whole. The Magi who arrived in Bethlehem were, from this perspective, representatives of the twilight of a form of spiritual knowledge that had enlightened humanity for centuries, but was reaching its historical twilight. They had reached the limit of what their traditions had been able to achieve. They perceived in what had arrived not only confirmation of what they had investigated, but something that completely transcended the framework of references that their traditions had constructed. And when they offered their gifts and departed another way, they performed a gesture that was at the same time the most dignified farewell possible to the traditions they represented and the delivery to what had arrived of what was most valuable in these traditions, so that the new impulse could use what had been achieved as material for the development that subsequent centuries would produce. The massacre of the innocents that followed the visit of the Magi in Matthew's narrative was, from Steiner's perspective, the violent expression of the polarity that the Christmas event had created. The polarity between recognition and resistance, between openness to what was arriving and the closure that tried to eliminate it to preserve what was there. Herod was not simply a particularly cruel despot, although he was that too. He was the representative of a spiritual principle that Steiner identified with what he called the Ahrimanic force, the force that crystallized and hardened, that resisted transformation, converting it into a threat to be eliminated, that used power to suppress what power could not understand and that therefore needed to destroy. Matthew's narrative had preserved with exceptional fidelity the spiritual polarity that had created the conditions of Christmas. On the one hand, the Magi, who had developed the knowledge and sensitivity to recognize what had arrived and the humility to offer the encounter what they had achieved. Of another Herod, who had the power and knowledge of the texts, but did not have the perception that the knowledge of the texts was not a substitute, who used the question for signs of arrival not to meet what had arrived, but to try to locate and eliminate what had arrived. And between the two, Luke's pastors, who had perceived the arrival in another way, through the simplicity of a heart that the development of initiatory techniques had not complicated, but also had not enriched with the depth that these techniques, when genuine, were capable of producing. The liturgical celebration of King's Day on the 6th of January, which Christian tradition had established as the conclusion of the Christmas season, and which in many cultures had become the main day of Christmas festivities, had from Steiner's perspective a specific spiritual significance that connected with the broader rhythm of the cycle of the year that he had developed with particular attention in his lectures on Christian festivities. The 12-day period between Christmas and Twelfth Day was for Steiner a period in which the relationship between the human being and the spiritual world had a specific quality that the forces of other periods of the year did not provide. It was a period in which the Earth's etheric field was in a condition that made the communication between the physical plane and the spiritual plane especially intense, especially rich in possibilities for the spiritual development of those who had developed. The sensitivity to perceive this richness, the arrival of the Magi at the end of this period on the 12th day, was the gesture that completed the cycle, with a precision that Steiner saw as part of the real spiritual structure of the events that the narrative had preserved. It was the gesture of recognition that arrived after the period of greatest spiritual intensity of the year, the gesture of offering to what had arrived at Christmas, what had been developed throughout a process of investigation that was analogous on its human level to what the 12 days represented on the level of the annual cycle, the condensed recapitulation of a journey that had to be completed before genuine recognition became possible. The significance of the Magi for the understanding of Christmas that Steiner had developed was, ultimately, the significance of a principle that expressed itself in the narrative with a clarity that conventional interpretations had often obscured by reducing it to a matter of cultural symbolism or picturesque exoticism. The principle that the encounter with what is genuinely greater than what we have achieved does not happen by accident or by spontaneous grace that requires no preparation. It happens as the culmination of a development process that had to be serious enough and honest enough to reach the point where what had been developed was capable of recognizing what exceeded what had been developed. The mages had reached that point. They had developed the knowledge and sensitivity and humility to recognize what had arrived. They had offered what they brought with the generosity of those who know that what they have achieved is more valuable when offered to meet what transcends them than when kept as the property of a tradition that had reached the limit of its own development. And they had set out on another path with the disposition of someone who had been transformed by the encounter in ways that made it impossible to simply return to what they had been before realizing what they had realized. At any time, in whatever form the more serious and honest spiritual development of that time produces, this gesture can be repeated. The star still illuminates the spiritual field for those who have developed the eyes to see it. The encounter with what transcends what has been achieved is still possible for those who have reached the point where what has been achieved is sufficiently developed to be able to recognize what exceeds it. And the gesture of offering to the encounter what has been achieved, rather than trying to subordinate the encounter to what has already been achieved, is still the gesture that defines the difference between genuine knowledge and knowledge that had become its own substitute. The dimension that completed Steiner's perspective on the Magi, and that was rarely developed with the attention it deserved, was the dimension of the relationship between the Magi and the future development of the spiritual science that he had elaborated. Steiner did not see his own work as a new creation without antecedents. He saw it as the continuation of a current of spiritual development that had run through Western history since Christmas, and that had preserved and progressively transformed what the traditions represented by the Magi had brought into encounter with the new Christic impulse. Alchemy, which had flourished in the medieval centuries as one of the most elaborate expressions of this current, was for Steiner neither the proto-chemistry that the history of conventional science saw in it, nor the purely symbolic tradition that modern psychologism had proposed as an alternative. It was a form of working with the spiritual forces operating in nature that had inherited elements of the Persian tradition of the Magi, transformed by contact with the Christ impulse in ways that distinguished it from pre-Christian forms of these practices. The search for the philosopher's stone was not simply the search for a substance that would transform base metals into gold. It was the expression in a language that mixed the symbolic and the operative in ways that neither later alchemists nor their modern critics were ever able to adequately distinguish, of a work of developing the spiritual forces that operated on natural processes in ways that corresponded to what the incarnation of the solar logos had introduced as a new possibility in the relationship between the spiritual and the natural. Astrology, in its deepest senses, which had preserved in medieval and Renaissance traditions something of what the Chaldean initiates had developed in its most elaborate form, had been another of the vehicles through which the heritage of the Magi had traversed the centuries. Not the predictive astrology that had become popular in ways that progressively removed what was deepest in its origin, but the investigation of the correspondences between cosmic processes and the development of human consciousness that had been the most essential nucleus of what the Chaldean initiates had elaborated, and that continued to be present, although often obscured by the less developed forms of the same tradition in the most serious currents of astrological thought of any time. The spiritual medicine that Steiner had developed as one of the practical applications of spiritual science, which would become known as anthroposophic medicine, was one of the points at which the heritage of the Magi became more directly operative in the present. The understanding that the processes of health and disease involve the spiritual dimensions of the human constitution, and that a genuinely effective medicine would work with all these dimensions. It was the Persian tradition of the Magi transformed by contact with Christic spiritual science in ways that produced something that neither purely material medicine nor the spiritual healing systems of other traditions had been able to articulate with the same completeness. What Steiner saw as the most fundamental aspect of all this continuity was that the task that the Magi had represented, the task of developing spiritual knowledge with enough rigor and enough honesty to be able to recognize what was most essential in the movements of the spirit in history and to offer to the encounter with what had been achieved, was not a task that had been accomplished once at Christmas and then remained in historical memory. It was a permanent task that each era renewed in the specific ways that its conditions made possible and necessary. In the present era, which had developed individual consciousness with an intensity that previous eras had not achieved, and which had created with natural science a form of knowledge of the physical world that had an unprecedented rigor and effectiveness, the task had a specific form that distinguished it from the forms it had taken in the times of the Magi, not the development of faculties of spiritual perception that presupposed collective consciousness as basis, which were the forms that ancient traditions had elaborated in such depth, but the development of forms of spiritual inquiry that departed from individual consciousness that modernity had developed, that built upon the scientific rigor that modernity had learned to demand of knowledge of the physical world, and that extended that rigor into the realm of spiritual inquiry in ways that corresponded to the specific conditions of modern consciousness without simply reproducing the conditions of consciousness of earlier ages. The three wise men have arrived, they noticed, they offered, they left by another path. And at any time when a human being develops spiritual knowledge seriously enough to reach the point where what has been developed is capable of recognizing what exceeds it, and offering to meet that excess, what it had achieved with the generosity that genuine knowledge always produces at that moment, the Magi are coming again. The star that guided them did not fail to illuminate those who had the eyes to perceive it. The route, he indicates, is no less real for being followed in the way that the conditions of each time make possible, rather than in the form of a journey through the desert that ended in Bethlehem of Judea on a specific day in the calendar 2,000 years ago. And the encounter that the journey makes possible, the encounter with what arrived at Christmas and that continues to arrive at every moment in which human consciousness opens to receive it, with the preparation that genuine recognition requires, is always the same encounter, always with the same magnitude that made the Magi prostrate themselves before a newborn and offer him gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and always with the same consequence, departure along another path, because what was found made it impossible to simply return to any starting point other than the encounter, had still achieved,